Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the faction Haqqislam. In this, as in other faction focused videos, we're talking about the playstyle, strength, and identity of Haqqislam the faction before jumping into Infinity Army to look at a selection of profiles that will showcase those strengths and identity. We won't be able to cover everything, but we'll cover as much as we can to really show off what the faction has to offer, as well as a couple of potential wildcards or corner case picks that might be interesting to explore if you're a new player looking for your own style or an experienced player looking for something new to play with. As always, if you like this content and want to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description or by becoming a channel member. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. Now, Haqqislam as a faction, what are its strengths and identity? I feel like the first and obvious place to start is the strengths of Haqqislam's irregular troopers. There is a broad selection of very strong, very efficient irregulars that can occupy a variety of offensive and defensive roles, and which you will typically see form the fighting cheap utility backbone of a Haqqislam list. Generally, these models will range from between 5 and 12 points. They're very cheap, and they can be very, very effective for that cost, able to outperform their points cost either defensively or offensively, do more damage than they're worth, or take up more time than your opponent wants to devote to a model that cheap. But this sort of plays into a broader theme of Haqqislam, which is not just that they have good irregulars, but that they have generally very efficient troops. It's going to be pretty rare in Haqqislam to find that you have the true most powerful in class of any trooper, but you'll often find that you have amongst the most efficient. So hacking, for example, one profile we will look at is Hassin Baram, which are 15 or 17 points. And for those points, you get a tremendous amount of hacking capability. Now, are they Asuras or Anathematics? No, absolutely not. They're well short of that, but they're very, very cheap, which means you can splash in hacking, you can splash in gunfighting, you can splash in close combat, which means that overall, a Haqqislam list will rarely have absolute premium hyperpower pieces, but it will have just a huge breadth of capability. You're not going to have the single strongest piece in any weight class, but you will cover so many bases. And this means that, for example, when you're preparing for an event, Haqqislam will often have the luxury of building lists that can just kind of cover all of the tournament bases that they might need to, because they can put in hacking and gunfighting and skirmishing and etc., and therefore be able to tailor their lists to do other things. Like, for example, you could tailor a list pairing not to deal with specific scenarios, but to deal with specific matchups or tables. And that can actually be something that is very valuable to Haqqislam, because tables are one of the things that I would classify as potentially a weakness of the faction. And this deserves some explanation, because honestly, to an extent, every faction is weak to running into tables that it does not want to see. A Pan-Oceanian player with multiple big multi-HMG style weapons does not want to run into a bug hunt table. Haqqislam does not want to run into that one table that is at every big 100-player, 50-table event where the TO just kind of ran out of complex terrain. We've all seen it. It's kind of unavoidable. In any sufficiently large event, you'll have those tables where there just isn't enough terrain to induce complexity. And in a worst case, you have things like it's just 8 rectangular buildings arranged like Team Fortress 2 Fort. And those tables can be very challenging for Haqqislam because all of those things I mentioned, unit efficiency. We have efficient irregulars, we have efficient bikers, we have efficient skirmish pieces, efficient gunfighters. For efficiency to matter, you need to play those pieces in a way that leverages them into the moments when they can perform more than their points cost. So your gunfighters need to be maneuvered and deployed and take engagements in positions where the fact that they aren't the absolute best in class doesn't matter because they're fighting into good fights. And your irregular assault troops, like your bikes, need to be maneuvered in a way where they aren't just gunned down like the 12-point models that they are, but actually make it to some part of the table where they can do damage or, trade up, etc. And to do that most effectively, what I find Haqqislam tends to need is more complex and therefore more playable tables. The table needs to have things that you can do to take advantage. And if a table does not have that, because it's just half a dozen geometric shapes with no complexity to them and just long, clear fight lines, Haqqislam will run into trouble trying to leverage its efficiency, and will fall to factions that have just bought the biggest gun, because you have the table where the gameplay is decided by the biggest gun, not by the play that you make. Now, fortunately, those tables are relatively rare, even in big events, and in a pinch, you can always just talk to the TO and say, hey, it looks like you forgot to finish setting up terrain on this table. Do you think we could do something about that? You'd be surprised how many TOs are totally amenable to having problematic tables brought to their attention, provided it happens before you've done something like roll for deployment. But regardless, it is something to consider when you're playing Haqqislam. Other than that, as you might expect with this trend of efficiency, the very top end of Haqqislam tends to be relative underperformers compared to other factions. Like our tags they're fine, but they're kind of mid. Our most expensive pieces are fine, but they're not the things that you reach for even in a 15 trooper list. But provided you build a list that sticks to between 5 and 40 point models, you can comfortably fit to 15 and just have an absolute banger, almost whatever you put together, provided you build it from the core of efficient irregulars, adequately supported, throw in your other capabilities, throw in your gunfighters, throw in your specialists. You have this wonderfully broad selection of extremely cost-effective pieces that will just let you always have game in Haqqislam. Haqqislam is one of the factions that taught me to try to make sure that of my 15 troops, as many as possible are capable of doing something, and as few as possible are just passive order generators, and it is a faction that can really, really effectively lean into that. Overall, I would say Haqqislam is comfortably one of my favorite factions to play, and I think probably more than any other faction, especially in N3, it has shaped my playstyle in this edition of the game. So it is an outstanding faction. In our tier list, we ranked it very high, and despite my comments about tables, when we talk about the profiles that we're going to get into, we jump into Infinity Army, I think you will see from my enthusiasm that we ranked it that high for a reason. Because this is a faction that is just absolutely chock full of things that you look at and you go, oh, that's pretty good. Wait, it costs how much? It's how few points? That is the Haqqislam list building experience. Outstanding faction. With all that said, let's jump into Infinity Army. Now, perhaps unexpectedly, given everything I just said about irregulars, the first half dozen profiles we're going to look at are the Haqqislam bread and butter power irregular pieces. And the first of those is Zulekia Narazova, Kum Enforcer. Now, in presentation of these irregulars, these are not ranked in any particular order of merit. All of them are very good, and you will want a selection of them based on personal preference and what you're trying to accomplish with a list. I find, as a rule of thumb, depending on how you're building a Haqqislam list, you will usually want bare minimum of 3 irregulars, but you may try and stretch anywhere up to 5 before the burden of having so many troopers that aren't regular begins to weigh down on your list. As good as all of these pieces are, they self-limit simply because you can't push beyond that like soft cap of 4 or 5 pieces. Because in any given turn, they just won't all be able to productively spend their irregular orders, and you will run into situations where you are limiting the power of your combat groups because you don't have enough regular orders to concentrate force through individual pieces. But within that soft limit, Haqqislam irregulars are excellent, and Zulekia Narazova is one of those. She's a motorcycle piece. She's on an 8.6 motorcycle, which is as fast as it gets in the game, effectively, and she is an absolute killer profile. Clocking in at a mere 12 points, she has outstanding close combat with CC attack +1 burst. She can alternatively just use her breaker pistols in close combat for +2 burst. Those won't stack in the active turn, but burst 3 in CC is still insane, or burst 2 with an explosive CCW, and she's got burst 4 breaker pistols at range, or light flamethrower +1 burst, which enables some absolutely filthy forks, including things capable of threatening even tags at short range. On top of that, she's dogged and shock immune, which means she can move through a minefield. Even if she fails the dodge, she will still at least go dogged. She has mimetism, she has smoke, she has whip 14. She is just an outstanding piece. There have been many, many games where Zulekia Narazova, just whatever point in the game it is she makes her run, she does things that a bear pod wishes it could do in as few orders as she spends. Hugely order efficient because the motorcycles will just move so quickly provided there is a path for them, and with that, dogged and shock immune, capable of doing just a tremendous amount of damage for a relatively low cost. Not always. Sometimes she will get shot down. Sometimes your opponent will find her. Being on a Silhouette 4 base has its weaknesses. But if you can launch an attack run with her, she's one of the best pieces in the faction and, in fact, in the game for doing far more damage worth of points than the mere 12 points that you paid for her. Pairing with her and next in line is her sister, Zamira Narazova, who is a very similar package, but rather than having the burst 4 breaker pistols and light flamethrowers, she has a light shotgun. Rather than having +1 burst in CC, she has Berserk. She's also 1 point cheaper and has an EMCCW. For a long time, she was just the worst twin. And now I think 11 points versus 12, the different capability, I would usually reach for Zalekia first in a vacuum, but then just put Zamira in lists immediately after. One particular thing I find is particularly worthwhile doing with Zamira is in Haqqislam, you will often find, and we'll get to reasons why, that you have 2 reserve drops. One of these will often be a Hassin Fazan, but I have found, if I'm going first, I really like the 1-2 reserve punch of the Hassin Fazan and Zamira in particular makes a better reserve drop than Zalekia. Because of her Berserk, you can deploy Zamira as your reserve drop impetuous with a clean line, right? You've seen where most of your opponent's AROs are. You can deploy her where she'll be able to impetuous, and then set up for a very quick, like, impetuous, spend regular order on a Berserk. When you're using her, one way to do that is to move her and then dodge her. Fierce 13 is a reasonable chance of success, and she'll move 4 inches on a dodge her into line of fire of an enemy, so that she can declare a 14-inch Berserk move at CC22, damage 14, EMCCW. I have just not won games, but set up a big advantage just by having her do that in the first 1 or 2 orders of the game. And she does that off the back of being an extremely good reserve drop. So definitely pairs well with her sister. I would usually take Zalekia first, but Zamira can do certain things, thanks to that Berserk, that can just be very, very powerful. Tags fear her, men love her, moving on to regular old Coom Riders. Now, these guys you will generally see more in factions like Dashat Company. In fact, it's just Dashat Company. I don't think they belong anywhere else. Than the Twins. But these things are still very good for the cost. And if you wanted to run a list that was more offensively focused, there is nothing wrong with taking 3 bikers, 2 of the Twins, and 1 Coom Rider. My preferred profile is the light shotgun profile. It's only 7 points, and it comes with a light shotgun, CC22 with a DACCW, although no martial arts skills, and just a generally very effective, well-rounded profile. You can only take so many of these because sooner or later the sheer weight of being Silhouette 4 begins to pin back your ability to deploy. And when I talked about how Haqqislam will want tables that have lots of play, part of that is the fact that you need to be able to hide these damn things in your deployment zone so they don't get shot up early in the game, because Silhouette 4 can be surprisingly difficult to deploy. But although the Coom Rider is often going to be the 3rd biker you'll take after the 2 sisters, still an extremely efficient piece for 7 points. They don't have shock immune, but they are still dogged, and there is plenty you can do with a piece with a light shotgun, mimetism, dogged, that is moving that quickly for that few points. Now, as the Coom Riders are the offensive choices, irregular choices for Haqqislam, the premium offensive choices, our premium defensive choices are Dalami Infantry, most commonly, but not exclusively, the Camouflage Light Shotgun Panzerfaust profile. At only 8 points, this is an outstanding defensive midfielder. It infiltrates, it has no mimetism, but it can get all the way up to the halfway line, where it is packing the wonderful combination of a light shotgun and a Panzerfaust. Now, these things are no helots, but they have no SWC cost, and they can fight inactive, and a Panzerfaust is a weapon that always needs to be respected. There have been many, many cases of someone disrespecting the threat posed by a Dalami and moving something like a tag or a link team out of cover, and you take an unopposed shot, or even just an opposed shot into a tag when it's out of cover, and that Panzerfaust cleans up. And this is another example of how irregular pieces like the Dalami can overperform and help carry Haqqislam through a game, despite the fact that their strongest pieces will be less powerful in absolute terms than those of the opposition. Now, it's important to note when using pieces like Dalami to have discipline about when you reveal. Don't reveal to take shots unless you are being threatened with a discovered shoot. Even then, you may wish to reconsider it. Or you have a clean shot against something in the open that's just an obvious trade-up. And the reason why you want to not do that is there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, is you want to sap your opponent of orders. If your opponent has to move and then move to see you, and then declare a discover shoot, it will often take a whole order more than if you were to reveal immediately the moment they come into line of sight from cover, right? So if we consider those two examples, your opponent moves along a wall, pokes out to see you. If you reveal at that point, then they can shoot you immediately and they'll resolve that fight in a single order, potentially. If they move out to see you and you don't respond, yes, they can declare a discover, but guaranteed they have to declare that discover, which means that guaranteed it takes one more order. They have to declare another order to declare the actual ballistic skill attack to clean the Dalami up. And so that means that just having that layer of camouflage, right? Two Dalami in a list are very, very likely to suck out a large number of orders from your opponent dealing with them, and they have to deal with them because they can't just run through the open and cop those Panzerfausts. Now, on top of that, Dalami can still be used offensively if they have to. This is a piece that can deploy up to the 24-inch line and has a light shotgun, which means that prima facie, it can potentially run at your opponent's DZ and shotgun a bunch of things if it has to. They aren't the best pieces in your game to do that, but they can be so close to the deployment zone that if they need to, they can absolutely make use of that shotgun. So for that reason, Dalami are one of the most popular irregular choices in Haqqislam. They are multi-role, and they fill part of that what is my plan for making sure that I get to have a first turn, even if my opponent goes first. If you go back through battle reports on this channel, you will see plenty of occasions where I have played against Haqqislam and I've inflicted 3 or 4 casualties or more on the first turn, and that's done maybe 40 points of total damage to the Haqqislam army because so much of it is doing things like chewing through pieces like Dalami infantry. In a very similar vein, our next piece is the Libertos Freedom Fighter, available to many factions, beloved by everyone who takes them and hated by everyone who plays against them. Libertos deserve particular mention in Haqqislam because, one, they are just a very good irregular camouflage model, but because you have access to things like Dalami and maybe a couple of other camouflage markers that you might take, Libertos slot very well into a very cheap, eminently serviceable, just general midfield setup. Because you have Dalami, you have other Mimetism 0 camouflage markers scattered about the midfield, which means that you can conceal your Libertos. So for other factions, like say I'm playing Toha and I deploy my Libertos, it's very, very obvious that the Mimetism 0 camouflage marker is the Libertos, the Mimetism 3 camouflage marker is the mine. In Haqqislam, you will have a selection of Mimetism 0 and a selection of Mimetism 3 camouflage markers, which means that, yes, your opponent is likely to suspect that there's a Libertos out there somewhere, but it doesn't get immediately revealed, which means there is just that small layer of fog of war that the Libertos is afforded, which just slightly increases its already excellent effectiveness. Otherwise, as with every faction it can be taken in, it is an efficient defensive piece, it is an efficient offensive piece, it does a lot for relatively few points. The only downside is the mine layer profile, which is the one you will usually want, comes at a steep SWC cost, which sometimes in Haqqislam you may decide not to pay depending on how you're building. Sometimes it will slot in very easily. And last in the list of absolutely premium irregular pieces, but by no means least, we have the Gazi Matya. Now, there was a time, if you find an N3 player and you say, "Old man, tell me about Gazi Matya and how they'll used to be," they will have one of two responses. If they were a Haqqislam player, they will shed a single gracious tear before moving on with life as Allah would intend. But if they were literally anyone else, they will have Vietnam War flashbacks. Gazi Matya they've been a defining piece of the game since N3, but they are still very effective in N4, despite significant nerfs. The big change in N4, though, is that Gazi Matya now, rather than having just effectively one profile, they have a fairly wide selection that you might choose to take. And I have found that the 5-point smoke grenade profile, the 6-point jammer profile, and both the 9 and the 10-point profiles all have different applicability and can be very useful. Now, it's the jammer, obviously, that deserves the most attention. A jammer is a comms attack that does not require line of fire and is fired in zone of control, and which can isolate targets that it hits. And unlike things like, say, Toha Ferroware or hacking, a jammer is indiscriminate. Anything even total immunity, anything can be, because it's not effective against comms attacks, anything can be isolated by a jammer if it doesn't have the veteran skill, which means that even things like Ariadne bears and dog soldiers fear being isolated by the jammer and stalled in their place. Now, the jammer is disposable, but it still gets 2 shots. It can theoretically be reloaded, and the Gazi has a tremendous whip of 14, which is very effective. On top of that, you can even use the jammer for things like for declaring intuitive attacks, which means that you can use it as a pseudo sensor if you need to. Just move it in zone of control of an enemy camouflage marker, declare the intuitive attack, and they will presumably reset, because if you succeed, you'll break the camouflage and they'll have to take a BTS roll or be isolated anyway. That means you can do things like use them against repeaters on rooftops. Any repeater, not just the Masai Moran, which I seem to bring up every video. Any repeater on a rooftop, you can try and hit with a jammer. That is just a very, very effective troop. And on top of all of that, the more expensive profiles have ballistic skill 11 boarding shotguns with dogged and smoke grenades. So overall, the Gazi Matya, particularly if you're leaning into the jammer profiles, falls more back into the defensive role because of the defensive strength of that jammer, but particularly the more expensive profiles, the 9 and 10.1s in particular, can definitely still push an offense. Final note about Gazi Matya is they are often very comfortable to include in lists because they are an irregular that tends to be surprisingly good at using their irregular order, even if they aren't the star of the show that turn. Even if they just impetuous forward, it's often the case that you'll be able to just use that irregular order and just move them into a corner. Just move them into a corner, a nook somewhere where that zone of control of that jammer is especially annoying for your opponent, and it's moved, 16 inches up the table by now. You project that zone forward, doing nothing but spending the impetuous and irregular order of the Gazi, provided you can find that place to put them where that zone of control is particularly effective. There we go again, getting back into the fact that Haqqislam really wants to play the table. So which of these irregular troops you like the most will be a matter of personal practice and preference, but Haqqislam lists will almost always start with a selection of these pieces to fulfill your offensive and defensive needs, and they're very, very good at that. At this point, I'll also mention why I'm not covering Hunzerkutz in this irregular setup, and that's because, and I've mentioned this in previous videos, this list of irregulars that I've just given you, they are absolute bangers, and they form the core of your attacking and defensive options on the cheap. You just can't take more than a certain amount of irregulars in a list. 4 or 5 is going to be sort of the upper limit, and Hunzerkutz just do not compete with any of the 6 profiles that we've just gone through. In that vein, if you're going to put Hunzerkutz into a list, I would, particularly in Vanilla Haqqislam, I would advise against it. There are some very effective skirmisher, regular camouflage pieces that can do everything that a Hunzerkutz can and more, with the sole exception of place deployable repeaters, which can be where Hunzerkutz fit in. But for me, and again, these videos are all done from my perspective, for me, the Hunzerkutz falls behind the essential attack and defense roles that these other irregulars will fulfill. If I want some midfield specialists, I will lean on regular pieces, and if I want network projection, I will use pitchers. Now, in the same breath as we talk about irregulars, we should talk for a moment about Saladin 012 Liaison Officer. Saladin is a piece that in Haqqislam has a particular and specific role. Now, so Saladin is not by any stretch of the imagination the best lieutenant for his cost in the game. There is a reason why you basically never see him leading 012 lists, despite the fact that he can be taken there. It's because there are plenty of other stronger, more efficient, like elite lieutenant profiles. In 012, we have the Alpha. In Morats, you have Kornak. In Ariadna, you have Veronin. And like all of these pieces in OSS, we have the Shukra, and all of these pieces are often going to be either cheaper and nearly as good or more expensive and much better than Saladin in this kind of dedicated lieutenant role. But that doesn't really matter because those pieces all exist outside of Haqqislam. And in Haqqislam, we have our regular baseline. And so if we look at Saladin, he gives us Strategos, not just level 1, but level 2. and +1 command token, which is not something I would normally hugely value, but if we look at +1 command token from Saladin, and the fact that level 2 Strategos letting you move troops between combat group slots will also often free up at least a couple of command tokens over the course of the game, we can see that what Saladin actually does for us is give us enough command tokens and regular orders to tolerate usually at least one more irregular troop than we would normally take in a list. So there are some quite capable lieutenants in Haqqislam that you can take alongside maybe some chain of command, but those lieutenants will necessitate that you take maybe one fewer irregular troops. Saladin gives you all of the benefits of Strategos, the extra reserve, the regular orders, etc., and with the command tokens that he effectively generates, lets you go from 3 or 4 to 4 or 5 irregulars and still comfortably have order pools that work. And that is really, really good because our irregulars are really, really good. Now, Saladin is not the lieutenant every single time I play Haqqislam, but I would say he comes in as my lieutenant in a good 80% of lists, specifically because I love Haqqislam irregulars, I want to play them, and he lets me play just a couple more of them than you usually would. Now, with our efficient irregular troopers spoken for, it's time to jump into our efficient regular troopers, and absolutely taking the cake here without question is the Hassin Baram. Now, in particular, what we're interested in here are the 17-point hacker profile and the 15-point killer hacker profile with upgrade Trinity -3. This means that if you use Trinity against an opponent in a face-to-face roll, they will have an additional -3 modifier, which really stings. 17 and 15 points respectively with Whip 14, BTS 3, those hacking profiles, and Ballistic Skill 12 pitches, which means they're not Ballistic Skill 11, which I find consistently fails me. The number of times I roll a 15 to hit with a pitcher in good range is truly prodigious. Hassin Baram are, without question, for cost, the best hackers in the entire game, and they are the only model of any of the ones we're going to go through today that I will say always take maximum availability of. And generally take one each of the regular hacker and the regular killer and the killer hacker. For only 32 points and half an SWC, this gets you 2 Ballistic Skill 12 pitches, full regular hacking orders, and one of the best hacking assassins in the game. That Baram killer hacker has opened up plenty of games for me, where the first few orders I spend are him moving forward, firing a pitcher, and then just blowing the brains out of some hacker in my opponent's deployment zone. And you can take, like, absolutely with this setup, you can afford to take a guided missile remote and just throw it in there and have it if you have the SWC spare. But often, a more efficient attack is to just go after all of your opponent's killer hackers, regular hackers, whatever is in their deployment zone. You do not need guided missiles to score casualties with hacking on the first turn against any hacking capable opponent. And if it is not a hacking capable opponent, then you just use the pitches to blanket their deployment zone. Then they have to deal with the fact that you're going to be hacking them as they move. If you combine the repeater firewall penalty with Trinity and the fact that this Baram has Trinity upgrade -3, you are even capable, if you fight on those terms, of engaging much heavier and more powerful hackers. You can go after an Asura before she has her own firewall up and have a very good chance of killing her with sufficient orders with the Hassin Baram. Now, you might get unlucky, she might win a face-to-face roll, you might fail your BTS, but she's going to be rolling on a net -3, you'll be rolling on a net +3, you'll have a burst advantage. If she doesn't have her firewall up, you can kill her before she gets a chance to activate. And this is from a 15-point piece. This is a 15-point piece that, under the right circumstances, can go after even 70-point hackers and have a chance to kill them if you line everything up right. That is just absolutely tremendous. And when you take the two of these, you have sometimes more easy access to repeater coverage than nomads have in a list. Relative to what you're investing in it, you absolutely do. A nomad list, again, can exceed what you're capable of. They can take fast pandas. They can pay 23 points for a heckler. They can pay 17 points each for a couple of Masai Morans. Then they can take their hackers. Oh, look, for a quarter of what nomads have paid for to get their hacking network online, you've got, I don't know, maybe 60% of that capability for 25% of the cost. Hassin Baram are the best hackers for their points cost in the entire game. Two of them should be in every single Haqqislam list, almost without exception. They are, among other things, the reasons why many Haqqislam lists can just randomly do missions because you've just thrown them into a list anyway, and you have enough orders to move them forward and press buttons. While you're doing that, throw some pictures out. I need to stop talking about them because I will go on and on and on. Let me just say that they have my absolute, like, S rank seal of approval put to in every list. I have to stop talking about them now, but by God, they are effective. Moving on from breeds, we have our other very near to auto-include, which is the Hassin Fidei. Now, a Hassin Fidei, frankly, you don't necessarily have to put it in every single list, but at between 25 and 27 points, it is very affordable, and the things it can do are so totally unique that it is well worth including. The power of an impersonator is to, as early as the very first order of the game, potentially neutralize something that your opponent had that they really did not want you to kill. And that is just an incomparable capability. If you're playing against nomads, you will have a selection of pieces, any one of which will be the bottom rung on a Jenga tower that could cause the whole thing to become crumbling down. If you've identified your opponent's lieutenant, there's a clear target. If your opponent has a link team and you want to either break the link or neutralize an ARO piece, if there's some big but maybe single wound gun like a Kahu, there is never a circumstance where there is nothing for a Hassin Fidei to engage, and the fact that they can just go for it immediately, for like roll a 15, land in the opponent's deployment zone, and just fucking go, boys, is very, very powerful. For that reason, the fear that they tend to inspire in opponents also makes them a surprisingly capable defensive piece, because unpicking a Hassin Fidei is hugely order intensive. Unless your opponent gets very lucky, it usually relies on moving up to the Fidei, making multiple discover rolls before you even get a chance to engage it, at which point it probably salutes and fires its shotgun. Many have been the occasions where an entire first turn has been spent getting up into some tower or something where I've squirreled the Fidei away in order to just have a chance to deal with it. And there is nothing worse in that circumstance than getting that one model up to make the discover roll and it just fluffs it the first time, and then you need to retreat that model and bring a whole nother model up. It is just fraught trying to deal with these things, which makes them a time waster for your opponent in their turn, as well as very powerful in your turn. And for that reason, not necessarily an auto include, but seriously take these things. And at 25, 26, 27 points with no SWC cost, unlike basically every other impersonator in the game, it's very easy to fit a Fidei in every single list. Combined Army and Toha, like they look at their impersonators and they're like, oh, I gotta find one SWC somehow, and that's not necessarily easy. Not so in Haqqislam. You just put it in the list. 26 points is incredibly affordable, and they fight very effectively in CC. They have shotguns. They have smoke grenades. They will just do what it is that you need them to do most of the time. And if you go for that whip 15 roll and you fail, that's fine. It was 26 points. It's not the end of the world. As mentioned, I will often have lists led by Saladin, and so in that circumstance, basically always the Hassin Fidei should be your reserve drop, especially if you're going first. Maybe not so much if you're going second, there can be other more important ones. But if you're going first, the Hassin Fidei should always be one of your usually two reserve drops. Like I mentioned, I like to run it as my reserve alongside Zamira, but there are any number of choices. The Fidei should be one of them. Now, quick honorable mention to the second Hassin Fidei, Hussein Al-Jabel, who is a Fidei that cost just an absolute ton more points in exchange for some shooting. Hassin Fidei Al-Jabel is not as good on his own merits. In fact, I would consider him to be one of the worst impersonators in the game for his points cost. But what he is a Hassin Fidei that does not share availability with your cheaper one. And so if you want two of these guys, you can have them. The second one is Hussein Al-Jabel, and you pay a premium for that. And that makes him quite fair, all things considered, because sometimes a second impersonator is what you want a list to have, and that's very scary. If you have Saladin and you reserve drop both of these, it's very difficult for your opponent to counter deploy both of them, which can lead to a great deal of damage potentially being done. Just be aware that any damage you do with Jabel is going to be less cost effective because he is much more reasonably costed at 33 points. Now, for those points, he gets more damage in melee and BS attack continuous damage, which is kind of cool. He has acid bullets, I guess. Ultimately, what he is giving you is a second Fidei at a significant points premium, not really any hugely meaningful upgrade. It's the fact that with him, now there are two of them. Now, while we're talking about things in the skirmisher category, I'm just going to briefly mention both Al-Hawa and Fazan. These are the skirmishes that I mentioned I think you should take if you were thinking about taking a Hunzagut. The Hunzagut has a place in particular if you want absolute redundancy in a list built specifically around guided missiles, but if what you want is a Whip 14 specialist, you probably want one of these things. Hawa are my preferred of the two because they have a really wide selection of fascinating profiles now. They have multiple mine layer profiles with relatively cheap points costs and interesting weapon loadout, but realistically the two that I am most commonly going to be using are the KHD and hacking device. At 24 and 26 points respectively, these guys they are absolutely no frills, but they are Whip 14 with full camouflage, full infiltration, boarding shotguns, and decharges. And so that means that they can do a variety of missions, scenarios, and classifieds, and they are very capable hackers, and in a pinch, they can trade with that shotgun. These guys are the guys that I mentioned when I say I don't like paying approximately 4 million points for a Guilang hacker. It's because these guys at 24 and 26 points, you could not ask for more for that points cost. Yes, 3 BTS might be nice, but it doesn't matter. What you get for them is a complete package that is very good at doing a variety of mission and hacking and utility pieces. If I have 2 regular hackers in a list, about half the time one of them will be the Al-Hawa. Now, slightly less common for me, but nevertheless very effective, are Hassin Fazans. These guys don't have hacking profiles. Proportionally, they're a little more expensive, but every one of those profiles is interesting. The Forward Observer is a ballistic skill 12 rifle, light shotgun, shock mines, decharges profile. They have ballistic skill attacks shock by native, which is fine, I guess. But then both of the other Fazan profiles are also interesting. The mine layer is not particularly special, but it is a ballistic skill 12 mine layer with a boarding shotgun, but it is 0 SWC, and that means that if you are stretched to the limit on your SWC, and Haqqislam easily can be, you can still fit a second mine layer after the Libertos into a list without having to scrounge as SWC by doing things like cutting hackers. And then finally, the chain of command profile. There are, technically speaking, a couple of chain of command profiles in Haqqislam, but the Fazan is the one that you want if you think you need chain of command. I will usually not take chain of command if Saladin is my lieutenant because he will sit passively away from the action. I will protect him to the best of my ability. But there are a couple of interesting heavy infantry active lieutenant profiles that you could choose to take instead in Haqqislam. And if you do, you probably want to consider a Fazan chain of command, which, hey, while you're paying 28 points for it, let's get a capable midfield specialist with a boarding shotgun. So those are our 15 to 30 point options. We will take plenty of those in a list. Then we get to the 30 to 40 point range. This is where you tend to find your gunfighters in Haqqislam, and you will usually want 2 or 3 of these in a list. And bridging the gap between that low end and the high end is the MTAR active response unit. Now realistically, there are like 2 and a bit profiles that you're looking at here in vanilla Haqqislam. The first is the MSV2 Red Fury. Now, downsides to this profile, a Red Fury is damage 13 and it will disappoint you from time to time. Upsides of this profile, it is a Shako Moon, no wounding cap, mimetism MSV2 gunfighter at ballistic skill 13 in a faction with ample smoke, which means that you can comfortably stack the hell out of negative modifiers against opponent troops. Like, total reaction bots hold no fear to this piece because smoke goes down, it gets to shoot, it is stacking often range and mimetism and the smoke penalty, which can easily apply a neg9 or a neg12 to a total reaction bot and just clean it up comfortably at very, very limited risk. The 6-2 move also gives it surprising mobility, particularly if you're doing things like jumping and climbing. It doesn't have super jump or climbing plus, but with that much movement, you can get it into surprising places surprisingly quickly, particularly with its forward deployment. Provided you don't try and use this thing to fight tags or heavy infantry, frankly, I'd be a little averse even to engaging Phoenix with it because he's relatively heavily armored. But anything short of that, if you can find prey for this piece, it can punch down against enemy models very, very effectively. And for only 36 points and 1 SWC, the total package, I would say, is efficient, ultimately fairly costed, but it's a very good model for winning gunfights. And if you put it in a situation where that pays off, it's very, very effective, and it will really help you capitalize on all of the smoke you have in this faction. Also well worth consideration is the hacking device profile. Now, this model doesn't have a marker state, doesn't have any special upgrades, but it is Whip 14, BTS, no wound incapacitation, shock immunity, which means that it is a really resilient hacker that can go, if it needs to, a couple of rounds with enemy KHDs and probably maybe survive. MTAR are also duoable, which means that you can combine either of these two profiles, but in particular the hacker, with some other piece in a duo to move forward and be a specialist in the midfield. Now, Haqqislam duos are kind of interesting in the sense that there's a very wide variety of options, but despite the fact, for example, that the MTAR Red Fury is duoable, I find myself rarely putting it in a duo. And that's because how I play Haqqislam is I want every piece, or I want 14 or 13 of my total 15 pieces to be capable of acting independently and able to do different things and contribute meaningfully to the battle. And that makes duos actually kind of not always fit in with how I want to really spread my army out and play the whole table. A MTAR Red Fury, typically speaking, I want to get it into the best possible position I can to gunfight and maybe pick some shots on enemy troopers on rooftops, get some kills, go prone, later in the game, scroll up and around and take some shots against something out of cover. And doing those things while I have a buddy nearby that potentially invites a assault that could take both of them out, just for whatever reason I find is not necessarily that useful. But the hacker is a piece that you might choose to escort something else, like, say, for example, an Azrael, which we will certainly discover and discuss shortly. That can be quite effective. It's a piece that's very amenable to duoing. You can even duo it with a Rafik forward observer remote, which can potentially have a Red Fury, but more often will just be the rifle light shotgun version, which means you have that wonderful combination of a hacker and their own repeater. Finally, you might consider the MTAR Doctor. Boarding shotgun, it can doctor itself, no incapacitation, is quite compatible with Doctor +3. It's a very good Doctor at +3. If you duo it, then it can't have helper bots attached to it, but you could, for example, have this thing, it's very expensive, but you could have this thing following an Azrael around, for example. I tend to limit myself to just the MSV2 Red Fury, because that does something very specific that I want, but there are a few profiles here that are quite effective. Now, moving up in price, we get to the Azrael Regiment. I am just going to say this, I think Azrael regiments are one of the most overbilled regiments in the game, only because it seems like they are considered a literal auto-include, and I would contest that they are not. But they are very, very good. Now, a lot of their points cost is sunk into close combat, right? They have that Berserk, CC23, martial arts, but most of the profiles that you'll be taking just have shock CCWs and can really struggle to do damage in close combat, which can make the martial arts nice. Like, it's always good to have that level of CC on a unit if you can kind of get it for free, but all of the discount these guys are getting from their impetuous rule is basically being used to pay for those martial arts, and those martial arts don't always pay off. Nevertheless, Azrael are still excellently started heavy infantry. They have frenzy, but they are duoable, which means that you can staple something like a Rafik to them. That gives you a specialist. It will restrain the frenzy, which can give you a bit more longevity out of the unit. And they are Ballistic Skill 14, Fizz 14, Whip 14, Armor 4, a BTS of 9, which is occasionally irrelevant and occasionally just wonderful to have. Poor Toha viral weapons trying to fight these guys is an absolute joy. And, glory be, AP weapons almost across the board. The two most common profiles are the AP Spitfire, taken either as Lieutenant or not as Lieutenant. I mentioned before, Hassin Fazan, Chain of Command. You can seriously take an Azrael AP Spitfire Lieutenant and then just a Fazan as your fallback and make a lot of use of the Lieutenant order. Or, much more of a niche pick, but personally I see it locally and I do enjoy it, the Azrael Doctor, AP Rifle, Light Shotgun. The advantage of the Azrael Doctor, I find, is that it plays particularly well on the regeneration rule that Azrael have. And this is what really sets them aside from other HI in their weight class. It's not the melee, it's not the religious, it's not the 6-2 move with cool dodging, it's regeneration, because these guys have got Fizz 14, and that regeneration absolutely forces your opponent to commit to going after and killing them if they put them down. Now, that often isn't necessarily that difficult, but sometimes it can be, and it takes orders that your opponent won't necessarily have if you've been playing an efficient game with all of your other pieces and really bleeding them dry. Now, speaking personally, I have something like a 70% failure rate with Azrael regeneration rolls, but if you don't, that one game where the Azrael stands back up after being knocked unconscious on a rooftop somewhere is just really, really good. And that really is what sets Asawira apart from other models in weight class. Now, they don't have modifiers, right? They're just rolling for ballistic skill 14. They're another piece in the Spitfire range band, which is at 24 inches, which is part of why, if as your gunfighting pieces you take just an Asawira and a MTAR, you are really limiting yourself to that 24-inch range band, and you can be at the mercy of tables that force longer range engagements. And that is a big part of why I don't consider Asawiras to be auto-include, because if you are building a list pairing that takes into account table pairings, like table influence on what list you want to select, you may want a list that is built for more longer range engagements than you can comfortably accommodate with the AP Spitfire Asawira. And that leads us into our next piece, the Special Deterrence Group Azrael. Now, for 1 point more than a 39-point AP Spitfire Asawira, you lose a point of ballistic skill and some BTS, you gain some armor, all of the bells and whistles fall off, and you get an AP heavy machine gun with +1 damage and continuous. Now, the Azrael will occasionally fail you. It is only ballistic skill 13. It does not want to engage a tag with mimetism, but in terms of ability to just win a face-to-face roll by a single dice off the back of that burst 4 and land those hits, +1 damage armor piercing continuous is a menace. And yes, I can and have one-shot tags and had tags one-shot by this weapon. And the existence of the Azrael is part of why I think the Spitfire Asawira is not an auto-include, because if you are building for tables and you need to contemplate occasionally having to have a longer range option, the Azrael basically has you covered. Now, the good news is you absolutely can take both in some lists, but if we look at what we've put in lists previously, we're running, maybe say we're taking some hackers, we're taking a MTAR. Once you get to the Azrael and the MTAR and the Asawira, you start pushing yourself out of also having things like guided missiles and a Libertos and etc. You begin to need to make sacrifices. You can only have so many 1.5 SWC models in a list, and so taking an Azrael and an Asawira will often mean pushing something else out. You have to make those sacrifices. This, by the way, is part of why the fact that Fidei costs 0 cost us why the fact that Fidei are 0 SWC troops is so good. Look, overall, the Azrael is a threat piece. Every now and again it will let you down, but equally often it will have those games where it's just like, oh yeah, I succeeded I rolled a crit, and you just blow something out of the water. And if you play regularly against the same opponents, or you have opponents who have regular experience against Haqqislam, they will learn to respect that. And the mere existence of the Azrael can do things like, for example, force Panashianian heavy tags to keep their heads down rather than risk the wrath of this piece. Because yeah, a Squalos might have 2 points of ballistic skill over an Azrael, but if the Azrael is an active turn, the Squalos can absolutely go all the way to dead in one burst because of that AP plus damage continuous, and your opponents need to factor that into their thinking. Overall, Azrael are an excellent piece, especially if you think you need to play on more open and wider tables against opponents who are using things like tags or heavier armor, and all of that for still falling within the 30 to 40 point price bracket is an absolute bargain. Definitely not something you would include in every list, and definitely don't take 2 of them, but one of them as a threat piece, in addition to all of the other stuff that you can fit into a list, excellent profile. Now, finally, here at the end of the video, we're getting into the wildcard picks, the things that I have played with or experimented with, and which I think other people may want to as well. And we're going to start here with Nauf. Now, Nauf is a piece where I am on record as saying, you know you're in a bad spot when Nauf is your go-to gunfighter, because although he's good, he's like just scuffed enough that he will let you down at those moments when you least want him to. He's only got 1 wound, he does have Shock Immune, only 1 wound, only burst 3, Mimetism MSV1 is just enough to usually stack the odds in his favor, but there are plenty of occasions where Nauf just isn't quite up to scratch, takes 1 round in response and goes down. Haqqislam are a faction where he is particularly interesting. Firstly, he fits comfortably inside that 30 to 40 point bracket. You can easily fit multiple models like that in a Haqqislam list. You can afford this guy if you can find the SWC. And the fact that he is a shock immune model with no cube, which is an annoying anti-synergy for many factions who would like to be able to doctor him but just roll, fail, and he's not coming back anymore, Haqqislam have access to truly premium doctors, including things like just a cheap Ghulam infantry. That Ghulam Infantry Doctor there is 15 points for a Whip 17 Doctor. That is an absolute steal. 3 points for a Helper Bot gets you doctoring capability that other factions could only dream of for like as close to free as you could ask for. And rolling on 17s means that the fact that you can't spend command tokens to reroll for a NALF is a much, much lower risk because you've got a significantly lower chance of failing than something like a Pan-Oceanian or Ariadnan Doctor. And if you're taking something like an Azrael, it can be really useful to have a pocket doctor anyway. So if I am playing a Haqqislam list that is built for playing on more open, longer range tables, a firepower setup that I actually quite like is Azrael, Nauf, Ghulam Doctor with Helper Bot. And the Ghulam Doctor literally just sets itself and its helper bot up to stand near, sit near Nauf and the Azrael, and if either of them go down, I just bring them back up and keep fighting. And it can be a little order intensive, but that lets you force through face-to-face rolls, despite the fact that Haqqislam is not nominally a long-range gunfighting faction. Between the two of them, those two pieces can at least theoretically handle most gunfighting matchups that you could ask them to do. Combine that with like a Hassin Fazan to do things like unpick links and then your smoke, etc. And you have a means in Haqqislam of pushing forward and playing, even if the table is kind of trying to say no. Next up, we have everyone's favorite meme in a box, the Sundook boot. This is a piece that just it doesn't want to work for me, except for like one game in 3 where the Neurosynetics AP Spitfire decides to kill 100 points in reactive. So I have mixed feelings about the Sundook boot, but just assessing its profile neutrally, it is very expensive. It is a luxury piece, but there are 2 profiles in particular that are worth occasionally experimenting with. The first is the Neurosynetics AP Spitfire. I tend to lean away from the viral rifle because the range I feel you need. This piece is going to want to basically never move, which means you have to be able to set it up in a position where it can cover not necessarily your opponent's deployment zone, but important pieces in the midfield. And that crunchy 8 to 16-inch viral rifle range band, I don't mind using as an active piece, but as a reactive piece is limiting. And so the AP Spitfire, particularly with a light shotgun as backup, I have found to be a performer. In addition, the fact that even tags have to fear 4 dice on 13s with armor piercing coming back in reactive, that thing can blow out a game, and it's a remote presence heavy infantry rather, with structure, which means if you found a way to include an engineer in a list, it can be easily recovered. The other Sundook boot that I like personally is the Mine Layer Viral Rifle. Again, very expensive and not necessarily a common performer for me, but that viral rifle is a serious weapon. It's a damage 14, burst 4 viral weapon with surprise, admittedly no other modifiers, and a mine layer for only 0.5 SWC. And if you find yourself wanting a 3rd or a 4th gun in Haqqislam and you're starved out of SWC because you're running other mine layers or hackers or missiles, or you've just taken a bunch of guns already, it's a serviceable 3rd or 4th high burst, high damage weapon if you can just get it inside range. Finally, both Sundook boot profiles there are cool in the sense that they add a bunch of camouflage markers to the midfield, and in the same way that I discussed with the Libertos and Dalami and, Al-Hawa, etc., you can already build an interesting obfuscation in the midfield where there really could be a whole bunch of things that your opponent has to worry about under those camouflage markers. The Sundook boot adds more to that. With decoy and occasionally mine layer as well, you can be adding 2 or even 3 Mimetism 0 and or Mimetism 3 markers to the battlefield, which you can combine with a Liberto and some Dalami and an Al-Hawa to have a really solid camouflage midfield that conceals a huge variety of different and interesting threats, most of which are very efficiently costed, and one of which will be the Sundook boot. Again, bit of a meme in a box, but it can be a very fun piece to play with occasionally. Last on our list of cool things to try is the somewhat more recently arrived Hassin Baram. Actually, it arrived at the same time as the Sundook boot, but anyway, it arrived with the Hassin Baram upgrade. Now, this is a piece that you look at the total capability, and it is certainly very nice, but the cost for Haqqislam is eye-watering. This thing is getting into tag levels of cost. In fact, in some cases, for only a couple points more, you can literally get an entire tag. But the lieutenant profiles especially I have found to be kind of interesting. Typically speaking, the viral rifle light shotgun paramedic tack-aware lieutenant. Now, 50 points is an absolute ton and even begins to do things like edge chain of command out of lists because you just can't afford them. It's very expensive. But this is one of the few ways to get a lieutenant that effectively adds 2 orders to your list by being able to use both its lieutenant and tactical awareness profiles. The reason why I typically wouldn't use the Red Fury is that the Red Fury really needs to be active and gunfighting, and that's a risk that which I'm exposing a lieutenant to that is somewhat, I mean, it's riskier, right? Obviously. Whereas the lieutenant profile can use its 2 lieutenant orders every turn to move forward, paramedic something, maybe press a button, maybe go into suppressive fire. Like the fact that with those 2 orders, tack away lieutenant, you can move and suppressive fire, is if you're willing to put it in a position where your opponent is just like, no, that's too difficult. I don't want to fight that. I'll just go somewhere else. The damn thing has Mimetism 3, BS13, MSV1, and it's packing a viral rifle. I just don't want to deal with this right now. That kind of thing you can do with the Hassin Baram. Overall, it's an incredibly luxury pick, but if you're really trying to push your order counts up and you just want to have a game without Saladin, I feel like your lieutenant choices, realistically, you could always take a Ghulam lieutenant, but if you're doing that, then you need to take a second Ghulam lieutenant, and at that point, maybe you take a Hafsa instead and pretend to be something and whatever. If you want a heavy infantry lieutenant and you want to actively spend that LT order, then your 2 choices really are the Asawira, which is very serviceable, totally fine to take the AP Spitfire Asawira as an LT, just take chain of command as well. Or, frankly, the back pocket pick, which can be very fun and very interesting, is the Paramedic Lieutenant Boktar, or potentially the Red Fury Lieutenant Boktar, but again, I would lean toward the Viral Rifle. Finally, we'll have a very quick talk about our tags. So there are 3, the Shakush, the Magariba, and the Trip Hammer. The Trip Hammer is cheap and I think worth exploring, but ultimately is a piece that I see very rarely in Haqqislam. The Magariba and the Shakush are both interesting cases to discuss. Now, the Magariba is a piece that I will regularly malign for being too expensive. It's paying a lot of points for generally a combination of esoteric weapon loadouts, although mine dispensers are very, very fun, and the 360 visor. Ultimately, the Magariba feels like it is probably about 8 points overcosted on pretty much all of its profiles, maybe more than that. However, because of all of the irregulars we have in Haqqislam, because of everything else, all of this efficiency that makes up the faction, you can occasionally accommodate an expensive luxury piece like this. Hell, if you could take a Sundook boot, you could feasibly cut that, find some points, and get a Magariba guard or a Shakush instead. The biggest issue with the Magariba is that she is in a stonkingly huge Silhouette 8 base, which if you have also taken some Coom Riders or the Twins, you can find yourself just struggling to fit everything into a deployment zone and still have everything actually like covered from enemy fire. But with that as a restriction, the fact that it has baggage even can be very cool because you have, if you've taken Gazi Matya and Hassin Baram, you can have 3 or even 4 models plus the Magariba with her own mine dispenser that like being able to reload. She makes a very good Combat Group 2 model if you're so inclined, having like a support Combat Group 2, where if there's nothing for her to fight, she can just fire the Mine Dispenser, reload, fire the Mine Dispenser, reload, fire the Mine Dispenser, and congratulations, you've just made the midfield hell for anything of your opponent's army that fears a mine. So ultimately, I think a piece that she's not going to see a ton of play in Haqqislam because that 15 to 30 and then 30 to 40 point bracket are just full of things that are very effective. But as an occasional piece in a list, if you think it's the time for her or you want to experiment, very fun. The Shakush, for its part, is a light tag, and ultimately it's a light tag that I feel like we can't ask more of for its cost, but which I will very rarely include in lists. And that is because it's stuck in the tyranny of having to choose between a regular heavy machine gun or an AP Spitfire. Once you're spending 58 points on something like this kind of a model, you can't really afford to have it not be able to fight tags, which really pushes you toward the AP Spitfire. But if you're taking a Shakush, it's probably because you're cognizant of the fact that you might have to play on longer range tables, which pushes you back towards the heavy machine gun. And that tension is very difficult to resolve and makes the Shakush really struggle to find a lane. Ultimately, it is Armor 6, BTS 6, 58 points, BS 14, plus 1 damage. It's only 6-2 move, which is surprisingly annoying some of the time, but there's an excellent pilot in there. It has a light shotgun, which means that if you've gotten the Shakush overexposed and killed, that little gremlin can climb out and template some things before it dies. I've absolutely called people with that in the past. Ultimately, the Shakush is enough of an efficiency piece that, yes, you can put it in lists, and yes, it will do just fine. really clearly think about whether or not, as a meta pick, like what are you going to be playing against to your knowledge? Do you need the HMG or do you need the Spitfire? What is it that's going to be the piece that will solve problems for you in a game? But if you can actually comfortably make that decision rather than acknowledging that the tension may be irresolvable, the Shakush can be kind of cool. And look, Haqqislam can afford one piece that costs this much, so it can be fun to play with. And with a little bit of reposing, the model is very, very cool. So that wraps up our Haqqislam faction focus, clocking in at almost an hour at time of recording. I hope you enjoyed it. Just as a sample list, we have one on screen there that utilizes some of the principles that I've spoken about over the course of this video. This is not necessarily my go-to Haqqislam list, but it's something I threw together that tries to cover off on some of what I've talked about, some of the things that Haqqislam might consider playing into. This is a sample list that you might use if you wanted to have a second list that can play into longer range or more gunfight centric games. If you've made it this far into the video, do let me know if you like this as an addition to the end of the videos, just a sample list to tie together what I've been talking about. Something I've avoided doing for other faction focuses because I feel like it can lean too far into the just play this list, it is the best list, which is often not going to be something that you'd ever want to recommend for any faction because there are far too many ways to play them, but something I thought I'd throw in this particular case because I wrote this list recently and it looked really interesting. Regardless, as always, I hope you enjoyed this. There will be more faction focuses to come. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. Channel members and video supporters that have requests for faction focuses, topics, and videos will always get priority. I do try to look after my supporters where I can. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.